Hello, Once Forest Focus. As Nottingham Forest face a major summer rebuild with, as we record this, Morgan Gibbs-White and Anthony Elanga set to leave the club. Lots of work to do. All eyes on Edu, who's in charge of the whole global operation for the Marinakis family. A lot of expectations for him to be a key cog in this. So I wanted to get some thoughts from our resident Arsenal fan, Tom Marshall-Bailey, on Edu's time there, what he did, what he didn't do, how he's perceived, and what he might do at Forest. Lots to cover, Tom. How are you today?
Yeah, it's funny. I said to you off air, didn't I, that it felt like today might be a therapy session for the pair of us, in terms of obviously the Gibbs-White and Elanga situation, from your perspective, and from my perspective, trying to just get my head around why we've decided that Noni Madueke is the only winger that we can find in world football worth 50 million. I'm I'm probably not taking it as badly as some fans. I'm not sure if you've seen the defacing of murals by the Emirates Stadium today, which is, just
Wow.
absolute insanity, to be honest with you. But I'm kind of shocked by nothing in football these days. Equally, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't completely perplexed by the signing and why we're doing it, and quite why we are determined to give Chelsea lots of money every single summer. Yeah, alas, we'll talk about Edu will probably helpfully take my mind off Madueke a little bit for the next half an hour or so.
Yeah, football. Sometimes you wonder why we love football, because it can be painful and infuriating and very perplexing. So let's get into it then. On Edu, just give us your general thoughts on the job he did, and then I'm going to ask you some specifics around point A to point B from where he started when he left. A few key transfers, and obviously we'll talk about not signing a striker because it's Arsenal. But what's your general overview on Edu?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, you have to say that he did a solid job. He came in at a time when we were really sort of in bed with the agents, if you like. The signings of, remember it well when we signed Nicola Pepe, that was very much an agent driven kind of deal with George Mendes, I believe. Not 100% on that, but I'm pretty certain it was Mendes driven, and Raul Sanlehi, who Edu kind of came in under initially, was the one who was just like determined to work really closely with agents, and Edu actually provided maybe a slightly refreshing um, approach compared to that, where we weren't doing agents favors like taking David Luiz because Kia Jarabchian needed to get his client a club, basically. And I think a lot of what Edu did, where we are now as a club, and look, I know that rival fans revel in telling us that we finished second 3 times in a row and all the rest of it, but I think if you look at things objectively, where we were prior to sort of the Edu Arteta combination coming together and where we are now, light years away from where we were. We were, very much. I remember when there was a graphic where Leicester had replaced us in the so-called Big Six of the Premier League, which feels a lifetime ago now. And that's what Edu came into, and he was kind of forced, I think, to come into a club where there were underperforming, highly paid footballers. Mesut Ozil, jumps to mind straight away. Lacazette, Aubameyang, all signings from a previous era that he inherited. And actually, one of the most sort of decisive and clinical things that Edu did during his time at Arsenal was actually to pay these players off. And seemed kind of quite a radical thing to do at the time, but the view that was taken was that these are drains on the club's finances, because there's no resale value in these kind of older players who are on big contracts that have been lavishly afforded to them, and they're not pulling their weight. They're not doing the business on the pitch where they need to be. And so I think that was one of the sort of the early things that really defined his time at Arsenal. I think he's made some great signings as well. I would say that I think it's why the sort of the hire of Andrea Berta is really interesting, and the kind of the dynamic with him and Arteta this summer, and how Berta operates feels quite different actually to Edu. Edu seemed to have quite a almost like tunnel vision with targets. It was very much that we were sort of had a singular focus on a transfer target at a time, and if that move failed, they would then consider what was further down the list. What we're having to get used to as a fan base in this window is that Berta clearly operates in a way where he conducts negotiations with multiple targets simultaneously. And that's kind of, you've seen that with something like the Victor Gyökeres, Benjamin Sesko debate in terms of who we're going to sign as a new striker. With Edu, it was very much we're gonna sort of zone in on this player and really, really go after that player before we consider sort of plans B, C, D. Probably a really good example of that was deadline day last summer. So we were trying to sign Joan Garcia, the goalkeeper that's gone to Barcelona from Espanyol, on deadline day, and we basically fully committed to that signing and didn't appear to have any sort of contingency fallback option whatsoever. That resulted in us having to pivot really sharply on deadline day to sign Neto, who was, of course, cup tied for the Carabao Cup, which meant we had to play a 16-year-old in goal in the Carabao Cup. And his one appearance for Arsenal, he attempted to make a save 10 yards out of his penalty area. So that's like the defining image of his time at Arsenal last season. And that was because we had this singular focus. So that would be probably the bad news, the criticism at times that I had of Edu, and that deal was probably a microcosm of that, where there was this absolutely singular focus on acquiring Garcia. It didn't pay off. I think we'd been sort of led down the sort of garden path by the agent over the fee that we'd have to pay for it, and the club refused to budge. And so, we didn't have that kind of approach that we're maybe now moving towards under Berta, where it's much more of a kind of throwing eggs in lots of baskets, basically. But I think, generally speaking, you have to say the kind of the squad build that Edu helped Arteta embark on was hugely significant, and I think he was an integral part of getting us to where we are now in terms of being Champions League semi-finalists. Finishing runners up on in 3 seasons in a row, which you can obviously see that from a glass half full or half empty perspective. But when he came into the club, we were really also rounds missed out on Europe for the first time in years, and I think he deserves credit for getting Arsenal, building the foundations for getting Arsenal to where they are now. Was responsible for bringing the likes of Martin Odegaard in, responsible for conducting a load of big contract negotiations for us as well. The likes of Saliba renewing, Saka, all happened under his watch. So while I think there were kind of imperfections about his time at Arsenal, I think there are there's context to be applied to that. I think the fact that Arteta's been brought in and very quickly moved into a position where it was clear that he wasn't just a head coach and he was going to be told by a sporting director, these are the players that you're going to be signing. I think you can see that this summer with the purchase of Madueke is that feels like an Arteta signing to me. And by everything that you read and what's been reliably reported by journalists that you trust, by all accounts, Berta has really driven the Gyökeres interest, and Benjamin Sesko was very much the player that Arteta sort of had his eye on. So it's an interesting dynamic there in that sense, because I think, maybe at the start when Edu came in, it was more of a brief of him, having that accountability for, which players we were going to sign, how that kind of squad build looked. But I think over time, Mikel Arteta took on more responsibility and was given that and encouraged to be a really vocal presence in the room when it came to transfer targets. So I think Edu, in the grand scheme of things, what he inherited, where he's taken us, I can kind of understand, maybe where some of those imperfections lie, and I also understand why he why he's taken this opportunity under Marinakis, because I think this kind of wider briefing that he's going to be able to kind of be responsible for the network of clubs, I think will suit him and his skill set, and it's ultimately a bigger and better job. And I think I think there are plus points about his reign as much as there are maybe a couple of question marks that still linger.
Just before we pick that thread a little bit more around some of the signings that Tom mentions, just a word for the Trent Navigation, a reminder, the British and Irish Lions Tour kicks off on Saturday. So you can enjoy 10 a.m. kickoff, enjoy your breakfast, enjoy your Guinness there. Get your tickets for our live show, gigantic.com. They're only a fiver. Lewis McGugan, Calvin Wilson on the panel, so that should be a good evening as well, I'm very sure. Right, let's have a quick look at a few things that Tom mentioned there. I didn't realise Arsenal finished 8th consecutive seasons, so there was some patience shown there. It was a bit of an Edu overlap, but some of these transfers, certainly Gabriel, 23 million, Thomas Partey, let's not talk about him, 45 million, Ben White, Tomiyasu, Odegaard, 30 million. They're probably the best ones. And then Timber and Rice came in as well. There's been a few less successful ones, but they're always going to be, I guess. I mean, I don't know if you would classify Igor Jesus, Igor, he signed for us. I've got in my mind. Gabriel Jesus as everything you want it to be. Zinchenko, players like that. But it feels to me, and Matt Turner as well. Got to mention him. But generally, Tom, I think there's been a lot of good deals there. I'll ask you about strikers, but there's been some groundbreaking generational signings to point to, kind of Saliba, obviously, Odegaard as well. So do Arsenal fans look at those as the main highlights for Edu?
Yeah, look, I think you look at the kind of the spine of the team now in the group, and I was actually looking through the squad list the other day, and I think in terms of players that were there pre-Arteta, obviously Edu had a little bit of a period there pre-Arteta, but I'm pretty certain that Saliba, Saka and Martinelli are the only, technically players like Reece Nelson and Carl Hine, who've come back from loan spells this summer, were there as well. But there's only a small handful of players in that first team group now that predate Arteta and predate Edu. So the big sort of nucleus of this squad, Edu was directly responsible for building it. And, we haven't signed anyone until this window. Since Edu's departure, we obviously, it was well publicised in January that Arsenal needed to sign someone in an attacking position, and we didn't. Maybe that was partly because of Berta coming in, but we've kind of almost, these 4 signings that we're on the, we've made 3 and obviously on the verge of making a 4th in Madueke. These are the first kind of post-Edu era signings that we can kind of actually look into. So I think, you look at the squad as it is and the current makeup of it, and it is essentially a reflection of what Edu's built. I think the massive frustration was probably last summer. Like, I think even in the cases you've mentioned there of likes of Tomiyasu, Jesus, Zinchenko, Tomiyasu was outstanding in his first season, but his body's failed him. And that's why he's ultimately been released this summer, is he has just not been able to maintain a level of fitness that has allowed him to play football consistently enough. And that's a real shame, because there've been some real high points of Arteta and Edu's time together with Tomiyasu in the team. Similarly with Jesus and Zinchenko, there's some regret there for me, because the 2022-23 season, when we signed them that summer, they were instrumental in us going from a team that finished 5th and having missed out on the Champions League to Spurs in quite gut-wrenching circumstances. We then all of a sudden just catapulted into title race contention out of nowhere. And they were the 2 players, along with Saliba, admittedly, but they were the 2 players that came in and were like the catalyst for it. And I genuinely believe in Jesus' case, and Edu was a real driving force behind that deal. Obviously, there was the Arteta link with it being former City. So I think they were aligned on that deal. But Edu, that was probably a rare example where he used his contact book in, with kind of people in Brazil to help kind of get that deal over the line. He was in really early in pre-season. That was quite a feature as well, or typically tended to be during his time, is we tended to do the sort of vast majority of our business quite early in the window. There are exceptions to that. Partey was very late. Tomiyasu was very late. Obviously, last deadline day, Neto and Sterling were very late. But yeah, Jesus and Zinchenko initially were great signings, in my opinion. And again, they have both suffered from, I think in Zinchenko's case, the team kind of moved away from him and beyond him. I think in Jesus' case, he suffered an injury at the World Cup in 2022 and has never really recovered since. And I think that's, again, probably not a reflection of Edu, I would say, that deal. I think that the one of the big frustrations looking through his list of signings, when he arrived, we were kind of almost presented with this idea that he'd be able to really tap into the South American market and be able to find hidden gems for us. And obviously it's really interesting that you've already gone and signed Igor Jesus. Probably not that hidden a gem now that he's obviously played at the Club World Cup and performed as he did. But it's interesting that that's the first signing of the kind of Edu era, if you like. We only signed Marquinhos, who was a really, most Forest fans might not even be aware of him. Completely, blink and you miss the signing kind of thing. Barely made any appearances for us. Spent probably the majority of his actual time contracted to the club back in Brazil in various loan spells. And that was really it in terms of us actually going and poaching young talent from his homeland. That was the only example that we could point to. And I think that, in addition to what I said about maybe being too focused on targets at times, I don't want to say that's a criticism necessarily, because sometimes there was an advantage to that. But I think that the lack of signings from his homeland and going into that market, which could have been a real opportunity, I think, for us, was a surprise to me. And I wonder whether that will be the case at Forest. It might not be. It might be that they see the Brazilian market, they see potential to sell on players if they bring them in from there. I'm not saying that will be the case with someone like Jesus, but there might be younger players that they might look to target that sort of profile of player, especially working to that kind of multi-club network, if you like. So yeah, I'm really interested from that perspective, because that would be one of my sort of regrets almost of his time here, is that we didn't get to see, Chelsea have obviously gone and got this Esteval Willian from Palmeiras. Should we have been across him as a player a lot earlier if that was his kind of specialism? So yeah, that was maybe a slight disappointment to me. But I think you look at his hit rate generally in the market, Gabriel, for me, probably one of our best pound for pound signings ever, I would say. The fee we paid for him, the improvements he's made under us, and again, I think being a Brazilian centre half, it's difficult to escape that link of Edu maybe having a good understanding of that player, and we've signed more Brazilians since then. So I think obviously some misses in there as well. Not going to pretend otherwise. Matt Turner probably as good an example as anyone, but think generally speaking, I would say probably a 7 or an 8 in terms of the work he did in the transfer window. The big stain that was left on his time here, I think, was last summer. And I think there's possibly a story that hasn't been told about last summer. It felt like it was very much a one in, one out situation that was going on with us last summer, to only sign Calafiori and Marino to build on an 89-point season where we missed out on the title to City on the final day. Never felt like it was going to be enough to really push on. And loan deals for Neto and Sterling kind of was a really underwhelming end to probably one of, I think Arsenal fans collectively would say, one of our worst windows in a long time last summer. It didn't feel like we took the ball by the horns and really capitalised on the opportunity that was in front of us last summer.
Yeah, Sterling looked like a disastrous signing when he signed, sort of a fading force. And the thing of giving money to Chelsea as well, which plays into my other final question, I guess, the striker thing. People have said Arsenal are one strike away from winning the league for about 3 years. They buy Kai Havertz for a good wedge as well from Chelsea, and they end up playing him as a striker who does a very good job. But is that a big stain on his legacy that you couldn't get, a Gyökeres or a Sesko type in 2 years earlier or 1 year earlier?
I think so. It's interesting this summer, right? Because I think one of the factors in the Madueke deal that it has kind of added to the sense of, well, anger, let's be honest, within the fan base is the optics of who signed when. So if Gyökeres had signed first and Madueke had signed in August with Kepa and Norgard, I should say, by the way, that I think, obviously a bit detached from Edu, but I think the signings we've made so far this summer prior to Madueke, I'm actually really on board with. I think Kepa's a far smarter pickup as a backup goalkeeper than either Neto or Garcia, in my opinion, at £5 million. That's 5 million I'm quite happy to pay Chelsea. But yeah, I think someone pointed out with our forward signings to this point, like in the Arteta era at least, that like 4 of them have been from Chelsea, and one of them, as you say, was probably in Havertz was probably initially earmarked for a midfield role, and it was like, hang on, we've got this 65 million asset who's our top earner. What do we do with him? We're going to probably have to play him up front to make ends meet, and there's an argument that possibly affected us buying a striker. The suggestion last summer was that Seshko wanted assurances he'd be the leading man, and that he thought that he wouldn't get the first team opportunities with Havertz kind of in situ as the leading striker at that point. I think going into last summer, Havertz had been on a run in the second half of the season where he was actually in really good form. He scored twice against Chelsea when we beat him 5-0, scored a decisive goal at Tottenham to win. Like, he scored a lot of sort of important goals for us during that period. And I kind of, when I go back to that point about the optics of the order in which you sign players, it's interesting to me how long and how complex the negotiations are with strikers and forwards, generally speaking. Like, this Gyökeres saga has just been exhausting to me. I work in football media, so if I'm being completely honest, as a fan, it's been exhausting. As someone who, thrives on this kind of transfer saga because it gives constant news that fans are.
You love Fabrizio Romano's Twitter feed.
Yeah, being brutally honest, like he'll know that all too well, that just drip feeding little non-updates around Gyökeres will cater for masses of people that care about it. But it's clearly not an easy negotiation, and so that's one sort of bit of context I'd apply to the lack of forward signings. Maybe is that they're probably not the easiest to conduct. I think you look at the breakdown of where we've spent money, though, maybe under Edu, and you're right. It's difficult to look at it and go, we really did everything that we can to kind of supercharge that attack, because the outlay on defensive signings, and I don't have the exact figures to hand, but the vast majority of signings that we made were defenders. We've signed more goalkeepers in the kind of Edu and Arteta era. I feel like that's probably quite a important sort of distinction to make, because he was there technically prior to Arteta as well. But yeah, in that era, he and Arteta prioritised goalkeeper signings, defensive signings. They clearly felt when they went in that the squad was completely bereft of any defensive talent, and they gutted that department and made that the big priority initially. And there was probably a continuation of that. And so you actually look at it on paper and you say, well, the signings have been Jesus, Havertz, Willian, Sterling, Trossard, Marquinhos. I think that's it. That's not a great list. Like I would argue that I think Trossard's actually been a really good signing for us. It was the same January window in 2023 when we looked as if we were going to get Mudryk, and then Chelsea came and blew us out the water. And that might be the biggest bullet we've ever dodged in the history of the football club, being brutally honest. Pivoting to Trossard and getting him for 20 odd million, and he's been a really effective player for us in the 2.5 years he's been here. I would put a tick against him. I actually would put a tick against Jesus. Havertz, the problem for me will always be the wages and the transfer fee that we committed to that. And then you look at the others, Marquinhos, Willian and Sterling, and they're all big question marks against those. It's not the greatest list. And I feel like I have to take a wider view of what Edu did and the various positions that he strengthened when it comes to any sort of conversation about his time at Arsenal. But I'm obviously hopeful that Andrea Berta is going to address that, because it was probably the one area before Edu left that felt like it was the incomplete part of the project to me. And obviously we'll have to wait and see if we're able to sort of complete it this summer belatedly.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks for Tom for that. There's a couple of interesting two main takeaways from what he says just while listening to him. Forest are not an Edu style negotiator. We have bids in for lots of players at any one point. So that's a big departure if that's how we are going to do things. Obviously, he's overseeing the whole group, so I don't know how hands-on he'll get. But in terms of that strategy, that's interesting. And our defence is rock solid and all good at the moment, unless by the time this airs, we've sold Murillo. But everything's fine and dandy at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if he signs attackers. Forest have just announced, given away when it's been recorded, we've signed Jair Cunha, which is quite an exciting young signing as well, I think. So I'm liking that, and it's going to be interesting to see how things develop going forwards. Right, just before we let Tom go, after the break, you'll hear my conversation with Forest fan Tim Desmond. He's got a pretty interesting job. This is a programme of things that we do while I'm away on holiday. Nothing current this week, which is horrific timing, because I'm going to a place with no Wi-Fi, but there is some interesting stuff coming up through the week, most notably an interview with Andy Reid, my favourite ever Forest player. Just before we go, though, a word for Global Telemetrics, and this is another vehicle secured within an hour after it was nicked. So, Tom, a little insight into some of the ads we do here. Here we go.
Evening, everybody. Here we are again, West Midlands Force area. Another stolen vehicle. Ford Ranger, stolen from Staffordshire. Pays to invest in security. Vehicle recovered. False plates. Pays to invest in security. Global Telemetrics. Recovered.
There you go. I think Tom's a Leafy Suburbs resident, so it might be up his street as well. So if that's of interest. Like I say, conversation on the other side with Tim. Tom will be back, certainly when we play Arsenal twice. And I haven't even mentioned this to him, but I'm hoping to have all our fan correspondents on separately for about 5 or 10 minutes just to preview the season for their club in the next few weeks as well. So I'll be on to you about that as well, Tom. But thanks very much for joining us, mate.
No, great stuff. Really, really glad I could help. And good luck for the upcoming season.
It's going to be interesting. It's going to be a big one, certainly, and looking forward to seeing how it all shakes out for both our clubs. But in the meantime, thanks very much for Tom. Here is Tim, and then we shall be back tomorrow after that. Great to have Tim Desmond with us, who is the CEO of the National Football Museum and, of course, a big Forest fan. Tim, good afternoon. How are you today?
Great. Thank you, Matt. Nice to see you.
Yes, you too. We'll get into what you do. Tell us about the National Football Museum as we go along, but we have to establish your Forest CV first and foremost. How come you're a Forest fan, first of all?
It's a long story, and I'll keep it relatively short, but I have to admit I grew up as a Chelsea fan because I lived near the stadium, and I used to be taken along there to see games way back when, in the last years of Peter Osgood and Ron Chopper Harris and people like that. And then I kind of fell out of love with football, partly because I had some connections with Forest through family. When Ken Bates arrived, we stopped going to games. And then I kind of moved to university in Loughborough and it drifted away a bit. And it wasn't until I'd lived in Nottinghamshire for a few years and my son was 7, and he started going to football games with other people. And I thought, I think I should be taking him. So I went along to Forest, and that was just kind of at the end of Paul Hart's period. And I went along to the game, really enjoyed it, was hanging around for autographs afterwards, and I suddenly fell back in love with football. So I've been a Forest fan for a lot longer than I was a Chelsea fan.
Okay, so it's the reverse of the normal story where pass it on to kids. It's actually your son that got you into it then. So that was a blessing, certainly.
It was, although with Chelsea, when I watched them, were in the second division, and then of course watching Forest, I got to see them in the Championship, but then League One. So I didn't, this is my Premier League time, and people always talk to me about Brian Clough, but that wasn't my time really. So I don't know how old I'm. I'm about a 28-year-old Forest fan, although I'm a lot older in real life.
Any regrets then for the Chelsea years or not?
Not at all, no, not at all. And I've no relationship with Chelsea at all now. I have been to watch Forest there, but no, I'm loving it at the moment, and I've had some great times at Forest. And I thought I was happy in the Championship, but the Premier League is something else. So no, I'm enjoying every moment.
Just kind of elaborate on, if you don't mind, what made you fall out of love with football then, and what was it about the Paul Hart team, or maybe it was taking your son that made you fall back in love with football?
I think it was the Ken Bates influence at Chelsea. So I physically stopped going, and I used to enjoy going and watching games. And I still do. I'm a season ticket holder at Forest, and for me, the biggest thing is going to see the games. And then I went off to university and I did drama and English, and there wasn't a great love of football amongst them. Even though I was at Loughborough, I started playing football at Loughborough and couldn't compete because everybody was so good. And then other things just overtook life. I did watch England, and it was all those terrible years of penalties. So even with England, I lost a little bit of interest, and then it just disappeared completely. And I occasionally went to football games, and I had friends talking about football, but it meant nothing. And it was literally my son wanting to go, and suddenly everything changed. And I kind of just enjoyed the atmosphere at Forest. And I'd lived in Nottingham for some time by then. But actually, the first game I went to see in Nottingham was not Forest, it was County. So I'd kind of half got in my head, well, I might support County just to ruin it for my friends. But yeah, Forest captured my imagination really from there on in. And I'm more of a fan now than I was probably as a kid in some weird way. Because we've had so many ups and downs, haven't we?
Yeah. And we will get into that. Did it help? Poor Hearts team was my team, really. The football was kind of vibrant, entertaining. Did that remind you about the kind of the purity of football when it's played the right way?
No, because when I watched Chelsea, you had Mickey Droy kicking everybody and Chopper Harris knocking people over, and it was the end of that period because they were all quite old by then. And my hero was Ray Wilkins back then, so they were quite equivalent. It was a different type of game then, wasn't it? But they were of the same level as Forest when I started watching them. So that's probably also why I connected with them. And some of the players then, people like Ray Wilkins, were managers at that period. So again, I had that little connectivity. So it's not like I saw the glory years of Chelsea. I missed them in the 70s, and then I didn't see them in any of the other periods. So I probably could relate to Forest more because it just was more of the same in a way. We just, at that time, kind of good old-fashioned football. Having said that, under Paul Hart, with Andy Reid and some of those the players like, I know Harewood probably came a bit later, but all those players were I thought, pretty impressive.
And then it all went downhill from there for a good few years, didn't it? We were lumbered in League One for ages. You must have wondered what you got into.
Well, I kind of did. When I think about Forest, I think about highlights and some of the key players and managers. And I love the Billy Davies period really because of just the passion and everything else. But the League One was a little bit. It kind of was terrible in some ways, but obviously we won a lot of games as well, didn't we? And then one of the happiest times before Steve Cooper came along was, seeing us kind of get into the Championship. And after, those kind of playoff finals, to just see Wes Morgan there and everybody cheering him and such a brilliant time. So, yeah, I probably enjoyed most of it, to be fair. And even though the players and the style of players changed, it's more for me the passion of football and the atmosphere in some ways. I'm not great. I was dreading you asking me about tactics and formations and everything else, and because I wouldn't really be able to answer it. I'm more about the passion of the game and, the highs and lows, really. And, the managers that you fall in love with, there's not that many of them, is there? But that's what I'm kind of more into.
Well, you're fortunate that we're recording this a week ahead of it coming out, so we can't go into too deep of a dive on things. I will ask you a little bit about next season and things like that before we move on. What about more recent memories then? With you when you go to Wembley, things like I was angling towards, have you got grandkids who go now? I don't want to date you and pile too many years onto you, but is there a third generation getting involved now as well?
No, Matt, no, there isn't. I'm not even going
Have a word with your
to
son.
answer that. I'm not that old, even though I remember Peter Osgood. So no, definitely my kids, and I've got a son and daughter, and they're both Forest fans, and both we all go to games together, and they're in their kind of mid to late 20s. So that's the kind of the generation. But no, I went to the playoff finals, which wasn't, as we all know, a great game. But we went to the box park, and with all my son's friends who I've known since they were 7. They're all in their 20s there, and I'd never drunk, at like 12 o'clock. So, but what a brilliant atmosphere that was on that day. It was just immense. And then when we won that, I don't remember much about the game, but I just cried because it was just all those years, and obviously I haven't seen them for as long as some people, but still 20 odd years under my belt, and it was just. I think that the biggest feeling was massive relief, wasn't it? Really.
Mm-hmm. Did you say you're a present? Did you say you're a present season ticket holder?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been a season ticket holder for about 20 years.
What part of the ground are you in?
In the B block.
Okay. So you're hovering near the A block then.
Yeah. Well, I've been. There was a period where we kind of drifted around. And I remember seeing us beat Derby, and I was in the is it the 5-2 game when I was actually in the A block, which was quite an experience. But the B block is a little bit more family orientated, some older fans. But still you're near enough the pitch to hear the shouting.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you talk about the atmosphere. It's not always been great. It's probably the last 3 years are different to some that have gone before. Certainly, I guess there were some pretty dark times before the good times. Watching, we had gates of 18,000, 20,000 for boring, scraping draws against Rotherham and stuff like that. That you probably remember equally well. Even now, I guess.
Yeah, and funny enough, I've forgotten all of those until you mentioned them. But I do remember sitting there at that time and thinking I could be somewhere else, and without spending money and all the time. So no, we did have those years, didn't we? And then the managers. I mean, I counted. Is it something like 30? I think there's been about 31 managers since I've been a Forest supporter. I counted last night, and you just think, yeah, all those times of hope and everything else. And I think, even though I started off as a Chelsea fan, I've earned my spurs really by sitting through all those years, and I haven't got the European years to talk about. Well, I might do that, next year, but I haven't got all those references of people of my generation.
True. So which teams were your favourite ones then? Is it all just mostly the last 3 years, I guess? Were there more that you really relished and enjoyed watching?
Well, the thing is, I can't think about teams. I can think about managers and players, but I can't quite remember where they all fitted in together. But I was, I'm kind of, I've got my heroes like people like Chris Cohen, and I meet people through my job, in the football world. But it's Chris Cohen meeting him and Robbie Earnshaw and Wes Morgan are the people that I'm in awe of those players. But I did love that kind of Wes Morgan, Luke Chambers, Kelvin Wilson kind of period where they were just, we weren't the best team, but we had such a solid defence, didn't we, for long periods. So I love watching those. And you're saying about me having grandchildren, but when I think of David Johnson and then Brennan Johnson, it's fascinating. I remember seeing Brennan Johnson on his dad's shoulder or his mum's shoulders or something going into the ground. One of those ones with dad on their back. So it's kind of it's incredible to see them progress. But I did love David Johnson, and then he had those injuries, didn't he? That kind of curbed his career. But to see all those goals coming in, but what period it is, I'm not 100% sure. But I do remember the Billy Davies periods are probably the key period for me, rather than Paul Hart, to be fair, because I came in right at the end of his particular period. And then Steve Cooper is the person I haven't met, and he's still. I mean, I love Nuno, but Steve, God, I think he was incredible. The relationship he had with the fans, I thought, was just out of this world.
Yeah, I've met him. He's a nice guy. Yeah,
Well,
I've not met Nuno, so I need to meet Nuno.
Well, no, and I know I haven't met Henry Winter. I know he's been on your show a number of times, and he speaks so warmly of Nuno. And I wasn't sure about Nuno until I heard him speaking about him. But he just grows on you, doesn't he? He's such an impressive individual, and that whole issue with the owner and him, which I think was dramatised from what I understand and edited, but it said a lot more about Nuno, I think, than anybody else, didn't it? In terms of just his status, but also how he manages everything is been pretty much impeccable. But to be fair, Steve Cooper was, I think, the same in a different way, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. Steve Cooper was more, media savvy is not the right phrase, but more front and centre. Nuno's kind of low key with the media and everything you hear about him. Both of them great managers, although Joe Worrell might have different things to say, but generally what you hear. But both of them, do great work, and you can see why they've been so successful, certainly. I mean, what are your hopes for not just next year, but the next few years then for Forest?
Well, I mean, I still are one of those people that are delighted that they're still in the Premier League. So in everything else is a bonus. And obviously, you said about the highlights, but kind of the Everton game last season and the Chelsea game really, really hurt. But my feeling is, well, we've been spoiled, haven't we? Because we've been thinking about the Champions League. But I'm saying that I'll be happy if we have a consolidated run in the Premier League. And talking about the transfers, but I know there is all the issues about buying and selling players, but we're in a good position where we're building up momentum. We're getting higher and higher caliber players in, and we're in the Premier League. I'm happy with. If we get anything else, it'll be a bonus for me, really. And I'm going to enjoy Europe this season and go from there. But I'm just a little bit wary of, I don't want Europe to kind of distract us from kind of performing in the Premier League. So if we're in the top half of the Premier League next season, we've had a run in Europe, I'll be very, very happy.
So are you worried about the bottom falling out then, and we're being that club that has a disastrous season or something, or not?
Well, when I listen to your podcast, which I do every week, I love the kind of enthusiasm of people like Craig and everything else. So I'm not going to say anything negative, really. I'm just saying that, I'd like to see us in the top half and kind of not be distracted by Europe. So I am very positive about us for the benefit of the past.
Excellent. One of the reasons I wanted to get you on is because you do have an interesting job. Tell us a little bit about what you do, and then we'll talk about how you got there.
Well, I'm CEO of the National Football Museum, which is based in Manchester, and is the National Football Museum. It's been around for about 20 years, first of all in Preston and now in Manchester. And so, as a kind of born-again football fan, it's a brilliant job to have.
How did you end up there? Did you work in Nottingham at the Justice Museum before that or something?
Yeah, so I was at the Galleries of Justice, and before that I was a teacher and worked in originally at the Nottingham Playhouse as well. So when I left Loughborough, I moved to Nottingham, but I was at the Galleries of Justice for a number of years, which is something totally different. And apart from Andy Reid having an interest in Irish kind of history, that was my only link with Forest there.
Tell us a bit about the National Football Museum then, because we always think everything's in London, and I actually thought it was still in Preston, so that shows how ignorant I am. Tell us a bit more about the museum itself.
Well, it was in Preston, at Preston North End, and we still have our stores there. And because it's really challenging to run any museum, would you believe, even a football museum, Manchester City Council brought it to Manchester, where it occupies a building right in the centre. And it is a really good place to be, Manchester, in terms of just being a really big football city for obvious reasons, but also the Northwest. And you're right, Matt, it is good. Although I'm from London originally, I've kind of the value of having football sites and cultural sites out of London really makes sense. And in some ways, I'm one of those people that feels like the National Stadium should be somewhere apart from Wembley. So, yeah, it's a great place to have a football museum in Manchester, and Manchester is probably the second city now in many ways. It's got so much going on in culture, let alone music, and we obviously got Oasis coming very soon, which will hopefully boost our visitor numbers. But it's meant that we're pretty strong with visitor numbers and get quite a lot of attention.
What can people see? What are the exhibits that you put on your advertising and billboards to bring people in?
Well, there is the solid element of history, and I was just thinking around Forest in relation to it. We've got the oldest surviving FA Cup, and which Forest won, and I didn't even realise that they beat Derby in that particular game, 1897, which may be where it all came from. So that's the oldest surviving FA Cup. What's interesting about that, apart from Forest winning it, was that Sheikh Mansour, who obviously has got a good relationship with Manchester City, loaned it to us because he bought it originally from David Gold. And I always love those stories coming out of it. So that's a key item. We've got, Viv Anderson lives up in the Northwest, and he's loaned us his European Cup winning medal from '79. So that's on display. And we've got then kind of a lot of, some of the League Cups that Forest won from, the 80s and 70s. And we've got Kenny Burns' 1980 shirt from Europe as well. We've got a match of the day kind of commemoration. I'd call it an exhibition. It's more of an activation, but it's got objects like Motti's coat in it. And Trevor Francis is on the billboard for that, interesting enough. So we've got the match of the day story. So we've got a football annuals kind of exhibition at the moment. Coming up, we've got Black in the Game, which is all about the story of black footballers and their history. And I keep on mentioning Viv Anderson because he does crop up in our Hall of Fame. He presented various different Hall of Fames, but he also is a recipient of the Hall of Fame. And the Garibaldi kind of TIFO was really good. So he's co-producing or co-creating an exhibition for us, along with a number of other people coming up telling that kind of story. But we've also got things like George Best Mini in the museum, and then just two other quick things. One is the oldest England shirt, which is from the England-Scotland game in the 1800s. And the other one it's a bit like the Magna Carta. It's the rules of the game, which was, literally the rules of the game set out by Ebenezer Cobb, who tells that story, so you know how to play the game. So things like that are fascinating, and then a lot of contemporary stuff as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of museums now for kids, they've got all interactive stuff and all that. Have you got all that kind of stuff as well?
We've got this great thing developed by Rezel, where you put on, your kind of glasses and look out into a pitch, and you can be in any pitch and be in kind of play various games and do various different trainings. So we've got that kind of, advanced interactive, but we've also got the Wembley goalposts, and you get to score your penalties against the Wembley goalposts. So that's massively of interest. And I can see us doing more of that kind of going forward. I haven't spoken about the women's game, but we do an awful lot around the women's game as well. And we also do the Hall of Fame. So we've got Euro watch parties at the moment. And, we're aiming towards 50% representation of women in football, which hasn't been difficult in recent years. And hopefully the Lionesses will do a little bit better than they did on Saturday and bring back a trophy.
Excellent. I'll drop a link in for the website if people want to get tickets because it's summer holidays. I'm not getting any commission or anything. I should have asked for some. But,
well, you need to come and see us, Matt. That'll be the next thing. Definitely bring your family as well.
We're actually up in the Northwest soon. So maybe so because it is the summer holidays coming up. Anything you want to say? Anything you want to add, forest wise, museum wise, or anything before we let you go, Tim?
Only, I think the success of some of the managers in the last few years, but I do think Garibaldi have played their part, and also yourself as well, and the podcast, because that's really, for me, you kind of think you're not the only Forest fan, but you and your friends are the only Forest fans, and you've kind of created almost like a family. And I do think that's played a part in just getting that atmosphere, which wasn't there before, back into the game. So that's the biggest thing. I want to shout out yourself and all your friends, because I think it's been brilliant.
Oh, Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that. That's very good of you. I enjoyed that. And if you enjoyed that, then do us a favour, hit like, hit subscribe. Do consider Patreon or membership, and just give us a lovely 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. Would be great. We'll continue a couple of these through the week. Obviously, you can tell that I'm not around, but we're trying to keep you informed and entertained. And the normal service will resume next week because pre-season's in full swing. And once pre-season's in full swing, we're basically back at it for the next 9 months. So hopefully you'll enjoy that with us along the way. Have a good day, everyone. If we don't see you tomorrow, we shall see you soon.